And our next speaker is Suzanne, who's going to give us stories of Pentecostal scientists.
Thank you. May have sparked some curiosity. I'm a Pentecostal and I'm a scientist. So I did a traditional scientific research degree, chemical physics, and became a member of a Pentecostal church. I've worked in science education, and I now work freelance researching stories to use in my communities of science education and Pentecostal churches. So today I've chosen some stories to celebrate Black History Month. I think it's really important that science communities can represent the contributions of Black scientists during particularly historical contributions. And I'd like to focus on today important contributions that have been made. There's much work to celebrate, but there's also much work to do. And I don't think it's any news to anybody. If you're a member of a church, there's always work to do to further whatever you're engaged with. This is what I'm engaged with. Engaging Pentecostal communities. We have large African communities in our churches, and I want them to be engaged with science, also in science education. I want science education to be engaged with the contributions of Black communities. So to look at some context, why do I use stories? So I'd like to look at this quote by Elizabeth Oldfield from TheOS. We come to our conclusions about things based on the relationships that we're in, the people that we trust, and the stories that make sense to us. I think as scientists, we tend to rely on data, we tend to communicate with data, but that doesn't normally work for the general population. For many people, data, they just blank out when they see data. So real stories are now being used by vaccine educators, particularly in the NHS. There's been a big problem with vaccine refusals. We saw that in the COVID pandemic. And statistics show that 72% of Black residents in the UK refused COVID vaccines. So that was a big issue in Black communities. So there seems to be some science distrust and some science disconnection in African communities. And I'd like to quote our colleague Nathan Bosso, who was here last year, and he said many people, Africans in particular, their distrust of science in the present stems in part from the way it was used as a colonial and racial tool against them rather than for them. So it's important to see that perspective. And then looking at science disconnection, a report from the Royal Society, it's reasonable to speculate that Black minority ethnic young people do not apply to study science because it's perceived as a white occupation. And then looking at the recent report on the Quiet Revival, Roman Catholicism and Pentecostalism are seeing significant growth. Close to half of young Black people attend church. So there's a real strong contrast there. We've got half of young Black people attending church, but they're not seeing science as an occupation that welcomes them. So I think that's a real concern for us. So I'd like to look at some historical African connections, particularly for this Black History Month. And I think it's important for us to know the connections that were there with Africans in the history of science. So the first one I'd like to look at is the smallpox connection. So in 1706 in Boston, USA, there was an enslaved servant, Onesimus, who described the traditional method of African variolation. We would call it inoculation, where a scratch is made in the skin and a weakened form of a virus was introduced into the skin. The servant Onesimus had known this technique. It had been practiced in his community in Africa for hundreds of years, and he was quoted as saying that he had no fear of smallpox. His employer was a Reverend Mather, FRS, who reported this story to the Royal Society 10 years later. So Reverend Mather had talked to his servant Onesimus. He'd asked Onesimus, "Are you frightened of smallpox?" because there were all these epidemics. Onesimus had said no, he wasn't frightened of smallpox. And Reverend Mather said, "Have you had smallpox?" And he said yes and no. And he described this method of scratching the skin and introducing a weak form of the virus that had been practiced in those communities and provided immunity. And he knew how it worked. He knew that he'd had a mild form of the disease which had prevented him and his community from being infected with smallpox. So that was in 1716, reported to the Royal Society. In 1721, in Boston, that method was used to save many lives in the Boston epidemic. And then in 1796, we have Edward Jenner using a similar method, using the cowpox virus, but a very similar method. So Edward Jenner got the credit for vaccination. Reverend Mather got many tributes for his use of inoculation. Unfortunately, there were no tributes for the contribution made by Onesimus. He didn't get rewarded in any way. He wasn't treated very well by his employer, and there aren't any tributes to him. So I think it's important that his name is known and remembered. And just to look at some a recent paper in Springer, it's an open access paper. Apparently there's evidence that this method is still being used in isolated communities. So this photograph was taken in Mali in recent times, and it's evidence that this method is still being used. So the second connection I'd like to look at is the Newtonian connection. So Newton was famous for his gravitational laws, his universal law of gravitation. Halley's Comet was the ultimate test for Newton's law. Newton's law, written in his third edition of Principia, was used to calculate the path for Halley's Comet. And it was described as Newton's eternal monument. So every time Halley's Comet returns into the Earth's atmosphere, it's an eternal monument to Newton because it was his calculations which were the most incredible ultimate test of his mathematics to predict the path for the return of the comet. So we've had two names so far, Newton and Halley. Halley's Comet is the eternal monument to Newton. I'd like to introduce a third name. Francis Williams was a scholar of science and Latin. He was nominated for FRS by Newton and Halley, and he was part of the inner circle. He was nominated, but he was denied fellowship due to his complexion. Sorry, the edges just missed off there. He was denied fellowship due to his complexion, and I think you can work out why. So in 1759 in Jamaica, Francis Williams had returned. He was a former slave. He'd been in England in the inner circle with Isaac Newton and spent around 15 years in England. He then returned to Jamaica, which was obviously a slave colony at that time. In 1759, Francis Williams knew that the comet was going to return. He understood the calculations that Newton had done, and he wanted to celebrate this triumph in Jamaica. Bearing in mind that Jamaica was a 90%, the population was 90% enslaved people, 10% colonialists, it's quite incredible that Francis Williams, at this time, many years after Newton had died, Halley had died, Francis Williams was isolated in Jamaica, but he wanted to celebrate the return of this comet. He wanted to celebrate it, and he had a portrait commissioned, and I'm just showing you a small portion of that to zoom in on his hand, and you can see his complexion obviously there. Historians have recently examined this portrait using X-ray analysis, and they discovered that he was actually pointing at the exact calculation that Newton had written in Principia. They found evidence that Francis Williams actually reproduced the calculation, which was, most people in the world were not capable of doing that. And Francis Williams was celebrating that in a slave colony. I think it's worth remembering his name. So the third connection is the Darwinian connection. And we have the name John Edmonston, which I'm sure some of you will have come across. Battery's running low. This is just about to switch off. I don't know if somebody can...
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know what. Go and get Matt. Carry on.
Okay.
We've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, so John Edmonston, picture tells 1,000 stories.
What sort of battery is it? So you have CSBA on that side. Is it
Yeah.
USB-C on this side?
Don't know.
I've got a USB-C battery. I'll be within
Okay. So John Edmonston, picture tells 1,000 stories. He tutored Charles Darwin in taxidermy. And it's not just the fact that he was tutoring Charles Darwin in taxidermy. Charles Darwin described John Edmonston as an intelligent and learned tutor. And bearing in mind, this was at the time in Edinburgh, where Edinburgh was the epicentre of racist science. Darwin was not engaging with the racist science in Edinburgh. Darwin was engaging with a former slave, paying him as a tutor to teach him taxidermy, which he was going to then use to preserve specimens. So he learned from John Edmonston how to preserve specimens, and he used that technique to preserve specimens on his journey around South America.
Carry on.
Okay.
You need to finish soon.
Okay. So the really important thing about Charles Darwin and John Edmonston is that Charles Darwin was motivated in his work. There's very good historical evidence. He was motivated by the concepts of monogenesis, that there was one beginning for humanity in Africa. He was motivated by the concept of brotherhood, and he was motivated by the concept of one human beginning in Africa, and the abolition movement. His family bankrolled the abolition movement. He was part of the Wedgwood Darwin family, and Darwin himself provided the science to underpin the fight against slavery, the monogenesis, the brotherhood, the unity of mankind. And it's worth knowing that one of his main sources of opposition was Samuel Wilberforce in Oxford. Samuel Wilberforce did the famous debate. Samuel Wilberforce also wrote a review of Origin of Species, and I'll just read a couple of words from it. So Samuel Wilberforce said, "It is to be feared that a degrading notion of the common origin of man and brutes tends to obliterate the distinction between the races of men and to blend the highest with the lowest." So he recognised what Charles Darwin was trying to do, and that was only his review of Origin of Species. It wasn't even the Descent of Man. He recognised that Charles Darwin was trying to do remove racial hierarchy. So for me, it's been really important to connect science with Pentecostal theology. In Pentecostal theology, we have a very natural view of science and the natural world and the supernatural world being one, that there's no great boundary. We also have a very conservative theology, and I nearly jumped for joy recently when I read part of the Fundamentals, which was written in 1917. The Fundamentals, the basis of fundamentalism, has a couple of chapters by James Orr, a theologian, who wrote, "Evolution is but another word for creation." I also nearly jumped for joy when I saw the book by Dennis Alexander. Dennis has just popped upstairs. On the front of Dennis Alexander's book, Creation or Evolution, Do You Have to Choose? Dennis is endorsed by a theologian, ultra-conservative theologian, J.I. Packer. And that is something that I can take into my church and say, look, you've got an ultra-conservative theologian here endorsing evolution. You've got chapters in the fundamentals saying evolution is but another word for creation. So the way I look at it, I look at Darwin as a Copernicus of biology. And for me, that gives me a big road into bringing evolution into my Pentecostal community, bringing together black communities, engaging with science and engaging with evolution.